Here we are in ancient Rome, and according to Chester Starr, for example, Rome was an impossibility from the start. I'm sure that every nation that they had conquered would disagree with that because they did last for a period of time. No question about that. Interestingly, when we look at Greece, and we're talking about Greek medicine in Rome, okay, what we mean by that is the Greeks, they were practicing naturalistic medicine at the time that they were conquered. In contrast, Rome, they hadn't developed science, they hadn't developed the same type of philosophies, they were using personalistic theories of disease causation. And while the Greeks fell captive to Rome, eventually the Romans fell captive to Greek philosophy, Greek medicine, and even the Greek language. It's interesting that there was a lot of xenophobia. Let's say xenophobia, and this is fear of outsiders. There was a lot of xenophobia in ancient Rome, and especially it was directed at those people that had been conquered. For example, Cato says, beware of doctors. They'll bring death by medicine. Similarly, Pliny the Elder, his epitaph says, it was the crowd of physicians, Greek physicians, that killed me. What's going on here? Why is there so much xenophobia? And why are they so adamant about rejecting the Greek philosophy, science, and medicine at this point of time? Why was there xenophobia? Why was there paranoia towards the Greeks? Why did Pliny say it was the crowd of Greek physicians that killed me? And obviously we see that they're butting heads here with respect to their world views. And certainly, even though Greek medicine wasn't perfect, you would be able to see its benefits, especially on the battlefield. Now, let's think back to Herophilus. And certainly, his endeavors, his escapades would have, give me a second here,
echoed
through the empire at the time. The Romans were certainly aware of Herophilus, and they heard stories of this guy cutting up living people. Well, you don't want that, definitely. And then you've got Archigathus, who apparently was way too fond of his knife, and he loved cauterization. Now, cauterization, it works as a way to suture a wound when you're in a pinch. But this is a type of branding, a tattoo. That's only for slaves, owned property. You don't brand a free person. So there's a lot of resistance, but eventually the Romans start to recognize that this Greek medicine, it works, it's effective, and they start to adopt it. One of the famous figures in ancient Greece is an individual by the name of Celsus. Now, by no means is he a physician. He's an amateur physician. He likes to work on his family and his friends. But he's important because he produces the first Latin history and encyclopedia of medicine. So he's consolidating a lot of information from the past. And he also lays out these cardinal signs of inflammation and infection. And we still use them today. So, for example, you get Ruber. He recognizes, if you've got a wound and you're seeing redness plus calor or heat from calorie, tumor, swelling, and of course, dolor, which is pain, there's a problem. Now, even though they recognize these cardinal signs of inflammation, and one of the other things that would go along with it is pus. Okay, you're building up pus, and that's a sign of an infection. They thought that pus was good, and what you wanted to do was encourage the development of pus. You wanted more. So this certainly would have led to a number of amputations in an attempt to deal with the onset of infection and perhaps even gangrene. Galen is the medical colossus, the medical giant, not only of the Roman era, but he continues as the medical authority for at least the next 13 to 1400 years. And it's not until his ideas are challenged that medicine begins to change. Now, we have a little bit of a different system starting to emerge here. While the Greeks embraced democracy, while they embraced debate, we're starting to move to a system where you don't challenge the authorities. A little bit tyrannical there. Either way, this medical colossus, this giant, this physician, he gained knowledge about anatomy and physiology not from dissection, or at least not human dissection, because that had been banned. That was now taboo. You don't do it. But he did have access to bodies. He wasn't a gladiator, but he was a physician to the gladiators. So he would have had the opportunity to see in individuals' bodies, as they were mortally wounded in these fights. In addition to that, he did dissect. But this was non-human animals. That's human, non-human animals. And he worked from a teleological model as well, so he thought that the same types of organs that you see in any mammal, for example, a pig, is also going to be found in a human, and it's going to look very similar. In doing so, he makes a lot of errors, a lot of assumptions about those connections. And even though he does that, he remains the authority, the unchallenged authority, until the 1500s. Now, it might sound a little bit familiar. We've talked about the idea of the corpse and how individuals didn't trust their eyes. And really, that's a holdover from that Platonic type of model. Don't trust your eyes. Our eyes lead us astray. Instead, trust the books. Now, the books that they were relying upon, they were translations, but they were translations, for example, of Galen's work. And Galen here in dissecting, he didn't have the opportunity to dissect a human. He didn't do that. He dissected, for example, pigs. And pigs have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobed livers. Okay, so 5 separate sections there. In contrast, a human liver only has 2 lobes. So we've got these 2 lobes. So when individuals opened up corpses, as we started to dissect, eventually moving into the 12, 13, 1400s, and they saw 2 lobed livers, they said, well, that's wrong, because Galen talked about 5 lobed livers. And he is the authority, the giant, almost seen as a god. Similarly, when people looked at the uterus, and Galen had dissected dogs and looked at the dog uterus, which has something that's referred to as a horned uterus. So these tubes, they go, they're the fallopian tubes, and they go to the ovaries, and you get this kind of V shape in the center at the top of the uterus. In contrast, a human uterus has a fundus, has this flattened section. So when individuals they looked at the human uterus when they dissected, and they shouldn't have been dissecting females. That was prohibited at that point of time. They said the body's wrong. And what made more sense is they were looking at a female. And at that time, they thought that, well, females, if males go wrong from time to time, their bodies, well, females, they're doubly wrong. They're imperfect. Individuals such as Aristotle, he said nature always intends to make a male. A female is an error. It's unbelievable that people thought that way, and that shaped people's perception such that we continue to grapple with inequality in our society because of the way that people for thousands of years thought about those differences between us. Anyhow, Galen, he's wrong, but people are trusting him, not their eyes. Another notable figure in the history of medicine is an individual by the name of Soranus. You might think that he's the father of proctology. He is not. He discusses gynecology and perinatology, so he's interested in women's issues. He's interested in the delivery or the birth of children and children's health. His areas of interest include when an individual should engage in intercourse for the first time, and he coincides that or links it with menstruation. So he says as soon as a young girl menstruates, then she has moved into adulthood. Well, we don't accept that today. The best time for conception, he argues, is immediately after menstrual blood has stopped flowing. Well, that's probably the worst time to try to have a baby. In addition, and maybe that explains why Romans have difficulty maintaining their empire. One of the kind of more modern things that he discusses is the idea that children should be brought into a subdued or calm environment. Okay, well, that's a good idea. We're adopting that today. He also develops this, what's referred to as today we would call it an APGAR test, named after Virginia Apgar, and it's a rating system for a newborn, and it's a system that rates from 0 to 2. For example, on appearance. So is the appearance of that child when they're born, is it a nice red hue or is it blue? And if the child is blue, well, this is a stillborn. We're going to rate the individual as anyhow. They get a 0. Looking at pulse, for example, you feel for pulse. There's pulse is present and it's strong. You give a 2. No pulse, a 0. If we moved over to grimace, okay, whether or not when you pinch a baby's toe or you prick it, that it responds, and that's ultimately about the nervous system. Yeah, we rate that, and then we move on to, for example, respiration. Is that taking place? Either way, that's an APGAR test today. That's not terribly important for us, just so you get an idea of where we eventually went. He had a similar type of philosophy. He said it was up to the mother to determine whether or not the child was fit for life. Okay, that's not what the APGAR test is doing, but it's that assessment that's taking place. And unfortunately, he said if a mother decides that that child is not worth raising, then infanticide should be practiced. In other words, you leave the baby to die of exposure. Some fairly horrific things going on at this time. And what it leads us to understand about the Romans is they ultimately had no obligation, at least that they felt, to a sick public or individuals that were not perceived as strong. One of the other really good ideas that he has is he says that a wet nurse or the mother, when they're breastfeeding, they shouldn't drink alcohol. That's not a good thing. And again, that's kind of a more modern idea. But most of his ideas, yeah, they're deplorable by today's standards. The Valtudenaria. The Valtudenaria is a type of hospital, and I'll start out that way with big quotations marks around it, because it's not a hospital in the sense that we would imagine, because it's not for, and I just said this on the last slide, the Greeks have no obligation, at least that they feel, towards a sick public. So this isn't a place for the sick public, like a hospital today, or, for example, the type of hospital that emerges in Christian Rome or Islam. They have hospitals proper. So the pagan Valtudenaria, they're radically different from the Christian and Islamic models. This is a place ultimately for resources. You want to keep your resources healthy, an obligation perhaps to them, so it's a place where slaves are healed and military. Answering the question, who is healed in pagan Valtudenaria, slaves and military. And as pointed out up at the top, and I didn't need to write that out, I've got it there. Sometimes my slides surprise me. They feel no obligation to a sick public. Health is your own responsibility in Rome. And what we're going to find is that sets the difference or creates the difference between Christians and pagan Romans during times of plague. And it creates a mortality differential. In other words, pagans, when plague strikes, they're going to die because their family and their friends are not taking care of them if they get sick. In contrast, while Christianity is starting to emerge, it's not an official religion until we get into the late 300s, 390 of the Common Era. Christians do take care of their loved ones, their friends, but also those individuals who have not been so hospitable to them, such as the pagans. And that is going to set the stage for the emergence of Christianity as the official religion of Rome. What kind of beliefs are apparent at the Lugnano archaeological site? Sometimes this is referred to as the vampire burial. And it dates to approximately 500 CE, the Common Era. And there's a number of grave sites here. The vampire burials, for example, they're individuals who have had rocks placed on their chest after they've been buried to ensure that they don't come back from the dead. And then we find another number of plague pits with children buried in them. As for the kind of beliefs that are apparent here, obviously this idea of a vampire, it's not a Christian belief. So we do see pagan beliefs, but what I want to point out is 500 CE, Christian beliefs have been adopted as the official religion of Rome. Paganism has been banned. And what's more is the Lugano site. This is also next to a church. It's a church cemetery where we find the vampire burial. So what we're seeing is pagan and Christian beliefs ultimately in the same site, and that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, a number of the individuals found in the mass burials, they have something that's referred to as parotid hyperostosis. And I've talked about this from time to time, at least when we started out. Here I'll draw a cranium, a skull, a quick one. Okay, a few teeth there. Parotid hyperostosis tends to affect the parietal bone, so the bones at the top of our head, sometimes into the frontal bone, and down here we'd have our temporal bone. So this type of sphenoid over there. So what we end up seeing is a type of porous feature, almost looks like a sponge toffee in this area. And what that indicates is iron deficiency. So we're going to try and squeeze that in there, iron deficiency. Iron deficiency can be caused by diet, but in this case, individuals suspect that it was caused by malaria. So why is parotid hyperostosis important for the researchers at this site? Because it's giving them some indication of what might have happened here to kill a number of children in addition to adults as well. What does Soren have to say about the presence of pagan artifacts in the mass burial? Ultimately, it tells us that Christianity isn't working for these individuals, and they revert back to older beliefs. Revert back to older beliefs in times of relative deprivation. We'll just say in times of stress. And you can imagine here an outbreak of malaria or anything, even COVID-19. It causes stress. There's no question about that. Let's move to the next slide. Soren suspected malaria, and ultimately his research at the Lugnano mass grave, it has been supported. It was supported by Solaris et al., which means and the rest, so his research team in 2004, and what they looked at was something that can be extracted from teeth. So here we got a tooth. We know that teeth have enamel on the outside, and then we move to dentin, and then deep down inside we have dental pulp. And that dental pulp, it's oftentimes well preserved because you have all this enamel around it, and you can extract DNA from it. So they look at the teeth of these individuals in that grave, that mass burial, and they say, yeah, we've got human DNA. No question about that. Well, no big surprise there either, right? But what they also find when they look at this is another type of DNA. And that DNA, I'm going to highlight over here underneath of the smear of malaria. They find the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum. So what that tells us is that this site, it represents an outbreak of malaria. Most likely malaria has moved into the area in the Mediterranean, and it's really starting to create havoc. And that probably goes alongside of a lot of floodplain irrigation as well. And interestingly, it remains in the Mediterranean and Italy until the 1950s, until there's a very aggressive DDT campaign to eradicate malaria. Some people think that following the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his resurrection, that Christianity immediately moved into the dominant religion of Rome and replaced Roman paganism. And what our textbook points out is that's not the case. Pagans were very good at revitalizing their culture, adopting new ideas, and as we've already discussed, Jesus of Nazareth was a very similar figure to Asclepius, the Greek, and Asclepius in pagan Rome. And what a lot of people don't say is it takes approximately 300 years before Christianity is adopted as the official religion of Rome. And what I'm going to say is what facilitates that adoption, based upon the literature and the research that individuals have examined, is an outbreak or a series of outbreaks of disease. Now let's go back and see what's happened here. In 300 to 311 of the Common Era, you get the edict, which is really kind of just a statement or the rule of Diocletian, who was the emperor at that time. And because of failed haruspicy, okay, right, trying to retell the future or foretell the future, I should say, and Christians, they've started to disrupt pagan rituals, and paganism is a dominant religion. That's criminal at that time. Diocletian prohibits Christianity. And in fact, this edict of Diocletian, it says, if you come across Christians in the streets and they're engaging in ritual or whatever, kill them. That's fine. And it really creates this period of strife, and that's not good for any empire. Empires are usually better when you adopt a position of multiculturalism, and that's what Rome was prior to this edict of Diocletian. Along comes Constantine, and Constantine has an edict of tolerance. He says this is not good for Rome, and he's also got a soft spot for Christians. His mother's a Christian, his father's a pagan. He doesn't adopt Christianity immediately. He doesn't do so until his deathbed. Either way, he ends Diocletian's persecution of Christians. We're still not at the rise of Christianity. Now, he recognizes that there's a number of problems with Christianity, and they're ultimately disagreeing with each other on a number of points. For example, when was Jesus of Nazareth born? And people can't answer that. He says, when did he die? And we need some consensus. And, they still don't have a date. It's a movable feast. Easter is determined on the basis of the first full moon of the spring solstice. Anyhow, he also says, okay, we also have this disagreement about what Jesus was. Not all people agreed, Christians. Some people said he was God and the Son of God at the same time. Other people said, no, that's not possible. Some of the early fathers of the church. They said, no, he became a God after his death, much in the same way other individuals, demigods, did, such as Asclepius. Anyhow, by the time we get to Theodosius I, in 390 to 391 of the Common Era, Christianity is made the official religion of Rome, and paganism has been outlawed. 300 years. Now, again, as I pointed out, people don't just whimsically give up their beliefs. There needed to be something behind this that pushed people towards the Christian faith as something that just worked better than paganism. Otherwise, pagans wouldn't have given up their beliefs. Following the disciples and the early fathers of the church, once we reach the 300s and 400s, there's a lot of debate going on with the early bishops and fathers of the church after the Council of Nicaea, because there are some barriers. In fact, there's a really big barrier to the adoption of Christianity as far as pagans are concerned. Asclepius. Okay, so let's just compare this to put it into perspective. And like I said, this stuff is discussed in, for example, the early histories written by Bishop Eusebius. Asclepius, he was the son of a god. He had a mortal mother. In addition to that mortal mother, he was a healer. He cured the blind. He addressed and cured paralysis. He raised the dead. He died. He was persecuted by Hades and Zeus, and he was raised from the dead, and he became a god in the heavens. When Jesus of Nazareth, and son of God, mortal mother, healer, he cured the blind, he cured paralysis, he raised the dead, he died on the cross, he was raised from the dead, and he is God for Christians. So this posed a big problem. As far as the Romans were concerned, they said, we've got one of those. We don't need another one. And in fact, maybe we're talking about the same person. And just to confuse matters even more, there's another individual, if you go to, for example, Egypt, Serapis, which is really a combination of Jesus and Asclepius. And in fact, if you look at the early images of Jesus of Nazareth, he doesn't have this long beard, muscular individual, long hair. If you look at the early images of Serapis, he does. The early images of Asclepius, he does. And eventually that type of imagery shifts over and is used with Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist. The early fathers of the church, they said, we recognize that Asclepius, he existed. Christians were saying that. It's just he wasn't a real god. He was a magician. He fooled people, and maybe he was even working with the devil. So here in early history, very different than what people understand today. Now, people needed to get past this initial barrier. So some people say, people saw or heard of the miracles of Jesus of Nazareth and they adopted Christianity. No, it didn't happen that way, because they had lots of examples of people who did this at earlier times. So even with that barrier, Asclepius, nonetheless, Christianity became the official religion of Rome, and people began to believe deeply in Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there's been a lot of research on what kind of stimulated this movement. And one of the things, and like I said, my area was looking at culture change, and its relationship to disease. outbreaks of disease, because outbreaks of disease, as we're seeing now, it causes a lot of problems, not just with respect to the physical health of people, but the psychological, social health. It impacts us, our economics, and on and on and on. And that creates ideal moments for new beliefs to emerge. And we're seeing that, people saying that this is a big fraud, it's a scam. Somebody recently, they said, oh yeah, they're lying about how many people have died in Ontario. It's a scam. They want to create panic. So the other day they reported 6 people, and I think if they wanted to create a panic, they'd come up with more than 6 deaths if they wanted to really lie about something and scare people. Again, people aren't thinking rationally, but that happens during plague, during disease, pandemics, epidemics. So looking at this, William McNeill, and he received an award from Barack Obama. They both were at the University of Chicago. Barack, I believe, probably studied under William McNeill. And one of the things he points out, McNeill, is he says that normal services, they break down. And we've seen that. There's no question about that. Those normal services, especially in March and April and May of 2020, we saw that stuff break down. In addition to those normal services breaking down, Romans, they fled plague-infested cities. Now, they didn't have an idea of contagion at that time, but for whatever reason, and maybe just sheer fear, kind of a gut instinct type of thing, let's get out of here. They left sick pagans to die. Remember, they feel no obligation to the sick public. But if we wanted to contrast that, CF, right? Contrast. Is that the type of belief system that Christians had? Or Judaism, right? Because Christianity is shifting over from earlier Judaic beliefs. And, they think, well, you can run, but God knows where you are. God's going to make you sick if God's sending disease. So Christians, they stayed put. In addition to that, not only did they remain within the cities, they provided care, basic health care. The basic elements of health care would include water, food, and shelter. And if you have water, food, and shelter, that gives you at least a fighting chance. However, if you have an infection, viral or bacterial, whatever it is, and you're suffering from dehydration, well, you don't need dehydration on top of a fever. It's going to contribute to your death. So if you do have water, if you have food, if you have shelter, this, like I said, gives your body a fighting chance. Now, if your loved ones, we're just going to go back up here to number 2. If your loved ones, your family and your friends, and they're Roman pagans, and they're leaving the city, they fled, and they've left their sick ones behind, are those sick ones getting water, food, and shelter from their families? Absolutely not. Now, the failure then to provide these primary elements of healthcare, food, water, and shelter, it results in higher mortality. In other words, we're going to see a mortality differential between Christians and pagans. So mortality differential, in the end, when people got sick, about 30% of the pagans, they died, versus only 10% of Christians dying. Now, if we look at this, out of every 10 individuals, 3 people die. Out of 10 individuals, 1 person dies. Okay, let's increase that a little bit. Let's say out of 100 people, 30 people die. Out of 100, 10 people die. And let's start increasing. If this is a serious epidemic, this is going to start to reach a number that is noticeable. Christians are taking care of their own, and as a result, they're surviving. And pagans begin to see that. And the only thing that you would, think about at this time is, why are they living? And their God must be more powerful than all of ours. And according to Rodney Stark, this sets the stage for mass conversions. Now, there's another factor that we have to get in there. So we want to say that these higher survival rates that we're seeing associated with Christianity, they're interpreted within the dominant paradigm, which is a supernatural one. So it makes sense to say, yeah, let's pray to that God instead. The other thing is, Christians didn't take care of just their own. The root for hospital, it comes from a word, gosti, which means to be hospitable to even individuals that were inhospitable to you or hostile. Okay, we see all of those roots there. So Christians believed in this idea of compassion and hospitality, early Christianity, to take care of your own and people who weren't of that faith. And this helps create new bonds and eventually conversions. I want you to think about this. I'll put down my pen. You can put down your pen. Say you're at a bar with a number of your friends. And I know, I'm there with my friends as well, and we don't know each other. Okay, we don't. I'm not your professor. And you look across the room and you see an attractive individual, and you make eye contact, and then all of a sudden you see their partner look at you, and you make eye contact, and then they start walking towards you with their friends, and they say, "Why are you looking at my partner here?" And you said, "No, it was purely innocent, just looking around the room, no biggie, And they say, "No, it's a biggie. I'm going to punch you in the head." And you say, "I don't want to fight." But you're thinking, you've got your friends there. They're perhaps going to help you out if there's a fight because he's got his buddies or she's got her buddies. And you look around and all of your friends are gone. They didn't want to fight. They left you high and dry. And now I'm watching this with my friends. And we walk in and we say, "You know what? If you've got a problem with this person, you've also got a problem with us. Just back off. Leave them alone. Big deal. They looked at your boyfriend. They looked at your girlfriend. Who cares?" And we've all fight in the end. We leave. Maybe I've lost a couple teeth. Maybe you have a black eye. Either way, what are the odds of you getting together with your buddies next week or the night after that and say, "Hey, let's go out and have a couple of drinks. You want to hook up?" And all likely, you're going to say, "You're a bunch of jerks. I want to have nothing to do with you ever again." Those people that helped me out, I didn't even know that guy that lost his tooth. And he lost his tooth for me. You're probably, if we should happen to cross paths again, you're probably going to say, "Hey, you want to have a coffee? You want to have a beer?" The same thing or the same type of logic is being applied. We start to form new bonds with those individuals who have given something of themselves for us. And this leads to the rise of Christianity because they're able to illustrate in those times of dire straits that somebody's got your back. And this leads to the emergence of the hospital, the first hospitals in ancient Rome with respect to Christianity. We're going to leave it there. We're going to pick up with the medieval period. Absolutely fascinating. I'll see you over there. Take care.